Dynamic data source routing in Spring Boot involves configuring the application to switch between multiple data sources dynamically at runtime. This is particularly useful when dealing with multi-tenancy, where different tenants require separate databases or data sources. Here's an in-depth explanation of the theoretical concept. Key concepts. Dynamic data source, a data source that determines which underlying data source to use based on certain criteria, e.g., tenant identifier. Routing mechanism, a way to intercept and direct database operations to the appropriate data source dynamically. Multi-tenancy. This refers to an architecture where multiple tenants share the same application while having isolated data. Steps to implement dynamic data source routing. 1. Define multiple data sources. You configure multiple data source beans in your Spring Boot application, each representing a separate database or tenant. 2. Create a routing data source. A routing data source acts as a proxy for determining which actual data source to use. You implement this by extending abstract routing data source. 3. Configure the dynamic routing data source. You combine all your individual data sources into the dynamic routing data source and set it as the primary data source. Especially useful when multi-tenancy target data sources, a map of tenant identifiers to their respective data source objects. Default data source, used when no tenant identifier is provided. How it works at runtime: request interception. The tenant filter intercepts each request, extracts the tenant identifier, and sets it in tenant context. Routing decision. The dynamic routing data source determines the appropriate data source based on the tenant identifier from tenant context. Database operation. The application performs the database operation on the selected data source. Advantages: scalability. Supports multi-tenancy efficiently by isolating tenant data. Flexibility. Easily add or modify data sources without major application changes. Customizability. Allows fine-grained control over routing logic. Challenges: thread safety. Properly clear thread local variables to avoid data leakage. Connection pooling. Ensure efficient management of connection pools for multiple data sources. Performance overhead. The routing decision at runtime may add a slight overhead. Dynamic data source routing is a powerful way to enable multi-tenancy in Spring Boot, providing the flexibility to scale applications for diverse tenant needs. Happy coding!